upon Greg Davignon to introduce our next panel. Greg Davignon is the President and CEO of the Business Council of British Columbia. The Business Council and ICBA work a lot on public policy advocacy issues. Under Greg Davignon's leadership, the Business Council of British Columbia is one of the preeminent public policy advocacy organizations in Canada. We're lucky to have Greg and his team right here in Vancouver, so please join me in welcoming Greg.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. And just before he sits down, I just want to acknowledge Chris Gardner. He's a real self-effacing leader in our community who just does fantastic work. He's an exceptional results-oriented person that I get the pleasure to work with on a regular basis. And I watch every day the impact he and his team are having on really important issues on your behalf. And so I just want to congratulate Chris and the team he's built here at ICBA and the legacy he's built that Phil started. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, Chris, on all our behalf. So thanks very much. So Chris asked me to provide a bit of context, and the Business Council, most of you know, there isn't 30 slides that we can't show 50 in. And the consequence of that, there's lots of graphs and line graphs, and I know Tammy was excited by the fact that I was going to be sharing those with you this morning. But it was really asked me to provide some context around what we see going on in the economy, and I think some of the challenges but also opportunities we have as a society. And one of my heroes, Winston Churchill, I thought provides a real concise definition of one of the foundational issues we've got, which is governments are a useful tool, but they're not perfect. And the role that they have in society, in my view, is to protect the public interest while unlocking the potential of people and the natural advantages and assets that we possess, and that they enable and support the prosperity we seek economically and socially. In democracies, this means setting rules and ensuring adherence to the rule of law, that the public interest is served, and the primary goal of achieving that prosperity is attained. And over time, confidence emerges in countries, in provinces, and cities as a result of that certainty. And so that businesses and citizens can take risk and can be supported in the dreams that they have with their capital, with their families, and with their talents. But it's all predicated on the ability to have certainty of where you can go. But when that promise is not honored, we end up losing confidence. And our country in Canada is a big place that over 150 years has prospered because of collaboration, and we've become the envy of the world despite some of the odds against us. We're tolerant, diverse, innovative, and rich in resources, both from the land and from our people. Our quality of life and the environment we have thrived as a result of the economic and social success that's mirrored in many places of the world and envied by many. All of this is based on democratic collaboration, our resilience as a people, the assets and certainty of the rule of law that we have. However, today, it's the view of many that we have a confidence problem in our country. It's been growing for some time. It didn't start 10 months ago here or a few years ago across the country. It's something that all of us have an ownership role in to do something about. In fact, just a few weeks ago in this very room, many organizations present here today started a movement that has been growing some momentum. We brought together over 110 organizations and 10,000 Canadians in a matter of hours to focus on what we care about deeply, our country, the prosperity, and the opportunity that many think we're losing out on and squandering. How do we address the risks and seize the opportunities we face and change the current competitive course that all of us see in front of us? We all share, as I said, this responsibility to make a change. We as a country possess the talent, the resources, and untold opportunities that others would and have died for. Yet we're complacent, and we're gaining a reputation globally of being too slow, too complex, and too costly to do business. This is an odd comment, perhaps, when you look at our GDP results the last 2 years in this province and in our country. In fact, BC has led North America with GDP growth 2 of the last 2 years. However, when you look under the surface, our foundations are eroding, and action is required. One aspect is our taxes, fees, and the time to get decisions are increasing compared to others. Our Canadian advantage, something that we've taken for granted, of low taxes, access to the U.S. marketplace, and talent are in question. Now, in British Columbia, we've had a carbon tax for some time. Carol Taylor was the finance minister and was brought in, and it was a balanced measure to do the right thing in a pure economic term and to ensure that it was done in a competitive way by lowering taxes. But as everyone knows, when you have a new tax that others don't have, you can have distortions. So over the last decade, we've seen BC move and others not move in unison or in equal measure. The consequence is that our economy and climate have improved, but at a cost. We haven't mitigated or leveled the playing field. In BC, we've added cost to domestic commodities, products, and services through the carbon tax that others have said they will add but have yet to act. And the current situation creates a cost disadvantage for most of our merchandise exports that make up 75% of our export economy. Commodities and energy that can only compete globally when we reduce capital spending here at home and lower operating costs and reduce our investment in R&D. So confidence is something that you can feel. It's born out of experience and emotion of certainty of what the future could be and how you can seize it. Today in BC, businesses are faced with 39 different material federal, provincial, and municipal policy reviews. Any 2 or 3 of them would cause uncertainty, and you as a business to pause, push back from the table, and wait. Or worse, take your capital, which is mobile, and invest it elsewhere. I see it every day, and the cumulative effects are something we need to pay greater attention to. It demands to be addressed by all of us. Dave McKay, CEO of Royal Bank just a few weeks ago, had this to say about the movement of capital out of our country. And Steve Williams, the CEO of Suncor, and Louis Vachon, the CEO of National Bank, have had similar comments in the last few days. Concerns over the cumulative effects of doing business in our country that's impairing capital investment across our economy. And how do we get to a place where we have competitive frameworks moving along? The reality is that we have so much opportunity and talent and such a bright future in front of us as a province and as a country. But we have a shared obligation to act on that confidence in Canada and to realize the potential that we all have as individual businesses, citizens, and as a province and country. Now, I'm pleased that this morning's keynote speaker not only understands the importance of certainty and competitiveness and the need to support people through a healthy, innovative, and inclusive economy. I've seen it for myself. He sees the economy and government's role to be an enabler to create shared prosperity. He acted on those values and principles with discipline and with urgency when opportunity presented. He set about to reestablish confidence in his province of Saskatchewan, and by extension did so to our country. In the period between 1981 and 2000, unemployment growth in Canada was almost 3 times higher than it was in the province of Saskatchewan. Real disposable income in that province had grown at a rate of 1/5 that of the national average. And per capita income had declined dramatically. But most importantly, and for those of you that are from the province of Saskatchewan, you will know in that 20-year period of time, the worst reality is that young people were leaving. And they were leaving not because they wanted to leave their families or the promise of Saskatchewan, but they were leaving for opportunity that wasn't present in that domain. So under his leadership, he set about to change not only the path forward for Saskatchewan and its people, but most importantly, to reestablish confidence in their province and in the people themselves. So in 2007, Brad Wall was elected the Premier of the province of Saskatchewan, and under his leadership and that of his team, the new government reversed the fortunes of its province and its people Through the late 2000s and early part of this decade, his province, Saskatchewan, became one of the leading economic powerhouses of this country, bringing back young people, entrepreneurism, capital investment, and hope for the future. And all of this happened despite having a population the size of Surrey and Vancouver combined. You could feel the momentum as he got off the plane. Optimism was everywhere and among everyone. And despite some tough years through energy and commodity cycles, Brad accomplished the, at times, I'm sure, impossible. He accomplished it while also driving home to Swift Current every night to his wife, Tammy, who I mentioned earlier, who's an accomplished engineer, and his 3 kids, a sense of community and commitment to his family. And he did this by garnering people's respect and support through his sense of humor, which you'll see, his pragmatic, creative, fair, and principled servant leadership that served the province well. This resulted in people giving his government their confidence by re-electing him for the 3rd largest majority in Saskatchewan's history in 2011 and again in 2014. But the real confirmation I think you see of our speaker's achievements is not the economic success, the social advancements, the investments that he made, the people's lives that were changed for the better, or the principal way he governed. It's best seen when Brad walks down the street. No matter where you see him, people yell out, "Hey, Brad." They don't call him Premier, they don't call him Sir, they don't use terms that are often reserved for politicians that have been in the public domain for 14 years. It's because he's a respected friend. He's seen as a trusted champion of the province and of our country. So before I call Brad Wall up to the stage, I want to let you know what is going to happen. Brad's going to speak, and it'll be great. Then we'll be joined by my friend Tom Clark. So Tom is going to lead a conversation as he's done for so many years. In fact, over 40 years as one of Canada's leading journalists, and now chair of public affairs with Global Public Affairs. Tom earned the respect of his peers, elected officials, and Canadians as the host of CTV News and later the host of the long-running and exceptional program, The West Block, on Global News. So it's now my pleasure to introduce, ladies and gentlemen, someone that inspires confidence in Canada and the people of our country, Saskatchewan's 14th Premier, the Honourable Brad Wall.
Thanks, Greg. That was very kind. It's very kind. Thank you. Good morning. Morning. Thanks very much, Greg. Greg is a long-standing and a very good friend, and I appreciate very much that you would give that introduction today and for your leadership in the work that you canvassed earlier on just prior to the introduction. Thank you to you and your team for what you're undertaking. Ladies and gentlemen, the ICBA is an example for business and trade associations across this country. This organization has, with courage and clarity and boldness, entered into the discourse and the discussion in this province about public policy in a way that few similar associations are prepared to do across the country. And I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. Thanks, first of all, on behalf of Tammy and myself for the invitation to be here, but thank you for that history. Thank you for that example to Chris and his team, to all of the members. This example is needed, and I'm certainly going to be sharing it wherever I go across Canada. I can tell you this, we were so impressed with some of your political advocacy work way back when I was the official opposition leader back before 2007. We checked out some of your advertising. There was one particular ad, a roller coaster ad that was meant to make a political case, a fairly direct political case that we were impressed with. We were so impressed that we hired the architect of the ad, Stephen Greenaway, to help us in our elections, and Stephen's here, he's at the back there, and we're grateful to him and his role that he played in helping us be successful in 3 different general election campaigns, so thank you to you and your organization. I want to invite you just very quickly before Tom comes up and we have a bit more of an informal dialogue. I want you to join with me in a bit of a visualization exercise this morning. Don't you just hate those breakout sessions and visual? Let me just try to paint a bit of a picture. Imagine, if you will, and heaven forbid that this would ever be true, but imagine, if you will, that thousands of Canadian auto manufacturing jobs had been lost owing to some external crisis, and that thousands more, directly and indirectly, were threatened to be lost. Imagine further that the federal government announced 4 things that they were going to do in response to this crisis. Number 1, they would call for the phase-out of the auto sector. Then they would walk that back, realizing that was a mistake, and call for it again subsequently. Lament that the auto sector had actually was still existing in the country. 2, they would announce that each province must impose a new car tax. And were they not prepared to do that, the federal government would step in and impose a new car tax. 3, they would announce changes in regulatory approval processes. In the middle, for example, perhaps of a very large auto manufacturing transportation hub project that would effectively help to kill that project. And 4, when one province tried to stop the movement of autos through their province to port, the federal government would denounce it as the wrong thing to do, but then do nothing about it. All of that is quite incredulous and silly, you might think, and I think, that I would agree. That would never happen in the auto sector, thank goodness. That would never be the federal response to that kind of an existential crisis in the auto sector. That is, without much hyperbole or exaggeration, exactly what has happened in the energy sector in this country. And that has been, frankly, only part of the damaging response we've seen, whether intended or otherwise, from the federal government. In fact, I would say at a time when federal and provincial governments should have been following the principle of do no further harm because oil prices were very, very low, at such a time as this, these were the policies implemented. And there's actually more that I didn't include in the list. What about our number 1 global competitor for energy sector investment, the United States of America? What have they been doing in this same period of low oil prices? Well, they've made it very clear, both at the subnational and the federal level, the state level and in Washington, that there will be no carbon tax. Certainly not in jurisdictions that are oil producers. We can have a debate about the carbon tax, but that's certainly the administration's position. Pipelines and LNG facilities are being approved and have been approved. They're not being regulated to death. According to the Oil and Gas Journal, the U.S. Oil and Gas Journal, more than 14,000 miles of pipeline are expected to be approved and under construction beginning this year in the United States. Man, we'd throw a party if we could get 14 miles approved and under construction in our country. The United States is expanding its pipeline network to supply domestic and foreign markets. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, in 2016, the U.S. administration loosened the restrictions around America exporting oil, and what we've seen since then is a significant increase in oil exports from the United States. In fact, between 16 and 17, they doubled. They were up by more than 1 million barrels a day in exported oil from the United States, and the trend this year is for something similar to happen. More increases in oil exports from the United States. Remember, they're our number 1, remember, they're our only customer if we can't get a pipeline to Tidewater. There was also, ladies and gentlemen, a deal between the Prime Minister of our country, Mr. Trudeau, and then President Obama on methane emissions that folks don't talk about a lot, but it's a challenge for the energy sector. It's something we should be addressing, certainly the methane emissions issue, but the protocol would have been a challenge for our industry. I remember when we first heard about it, Christy Clark was hosting the Western Premiers here in Vancouver, and that's when we really delved into it because we didn't have a lot of discussion with the Prime Minister in advance of him doing this deal. Well, the Trump administration, the EPA, have walked away from their share of it. They're not doing it. Again, for good or for ill, we can debate about the wisdom of the policy, but the bottom line is they're not, and our federal government is staying with the protocol, staying with the targets. And so you can ask quite rightly, I think, the question as to what impact that would have on the competitiveness of our economy to attract energy sector investment. Those are some substantive policy differences on the energy side between our two countries. But there's something else, ladies and gentlemen. In the United States, far from lamenting the existence of the fossil fuel assets that they have, far from wishing that maybe they weren't even there, they see the resource, I think, for what it is. At the very least, it's the transition to something cleaner, but it's something that the world wants. Global oil demand is increasing and forecast to do so for decades. And I think what we see in the United States, and at least on the part of members of this group, I think, and others in this country, is the notion that, if we don't supply it from countries that respect the rule of law and care about the environment, it's going to come from somewhere else, from countries that maybe don't have those priorities. So why in the world, they are saying, wouldn't we be a part of that export solution, that global demand solution, and in the bargain, become energy independent? Far from wishing that the oil wasn't there, they seem to be proud of it. Proud of the fact that they have that oil resource. Proud of the fact that it's creating jobs for everyday Americans in places where it hadn't created jobs before. The net result of all of this is demonstrably true or represented in the capital flight from our energy sector to the United States energy sector. Since last March, it's about $40 billion. $40 billion of investment from our energy sector, not to another sector, not to the tech sector or the film sector, to another energy sector in another country. Principally the United States, the Permian, and Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, but other parts of the world as well. $40 billion. And so I think we can ask the question, before we get to the more informal discussion, how did that happen? How did we pursue the policies we have as a country, and with some help from some provinces? And how did we get to the point where we've lost this much capital investment in the energy sector? And so I want to propose, and perhaps this is a bit partisan, that part of the reason for all of this has been the unchecked ascendancy of something that I call the new left, or the hard left. Jason Kenney calls it the green left, but I'm a Riders fan and I don't like to give him that much credit. The new left and the hard left doesn't like what is foundational about much of Western Canada's economy. And that seems like a pretty bold statement, but I'll try to present the case. They don't like modern agriculture, actually. If you take a look at their articles of faith, more on that in a moment, they don't like extractive industries, and they certainly don't like oil and gas. And the new left today is in power in your province here in British Columbia, they're in power in Alberta, and they're in power nationally. Because it's my view that this current iteration of a liberal national government is very much unlike the Martin federal liberal government or the Chrétien liberal government. Those liberal governments supported resource development, took a serious position on export issues, actually implemented incentives for oil sands development, and they were fiscally responsible. Certainly they had to put a priority on being fiscally responsible. I'm not sure you could attribute the current Liberal government with any of those three things right now, in fairness, and I'm not sure they would have a problem with me saying it. I think now they've said the budget's going to be balanced by 2050. 2050. I mean, maybe that's the kind of a plan you'd expect from, the Toronto Maple Leafs Stanley Cup Parade Planning Committee, but not from the Government of Canada. If you want to glimpse the aspirational heart of the new left or the hard left, read the LEAP Manifesto. It's written by Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein, and I think Stephen King wrote a few chapters. It calls for an end to oil and gas and an end to mining, and it calls for an end to modern agriculture. And the new left, the hard left, is pretty brazen about supporting, at least in principle, a lot of what's in that LEAP Manifesto. From my province, we had the finance critic for the NDP and several senior candidates attend a convention in Edmonton where the LEAP Manifesto, the NDP convention, where the LEAP Manifesto was being debated, and voted for it. This document calls for the end to modern agriculture. They came from a province, my province, that is 44% of the arable acres in the country. About 60% of the worldwide lentil exports come from Saskatchewan. That's modern agriculture. And they went to a convention and voted against it, and voted against oil and gas, and voted against extractive industries, the uranium mining business. Folks, that's how we pay the bills in our province. That's how we create quality of life. That's how we're able to contribute to transfers in national programs like equalization. And they voted against it. I mean, the LEAP manifesto, it couldn't be more anti-Saskatchewan where it called the We Hate Pierogies, Pilsner, and the Riders manifesto. And they voted for it. That's the new left. That's the hard left. That's the carbon left. It's very much focused on the carbon issue. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to learn in these next 18 months through some seminally important events in our country that I would commend your direction to and your attention to, as to the continued ascendancy of that particular group within our country, or maybe something different. Those events are the election in Ontario that's coming up June 7th, the election in Alberta in about a year, the national election within 18 months, the resolution to Kinder Morgan, and this is something we're not talking about yet. In 18 months, we're going to have a discussion about the renewal of the equalization program. I want to show you a map related to the program. Whenever I post this on Facebook, even in my old job, some of the staff would call it the map of rage based on the response it would get on Facebook and other social media platforms. So it's about a $17, $18 billion program, and for the last 3 or 4 years, this is how the payout has looked. So you can see we're going to need a steady hand nationally and earnest women and men of good faith to negotiate significant improvements to the program without hurting the unity of the country that we love. But this can't stand. Not when hydro resources are not counted in the formula, not when more than half the program goes to an economy in our country that's 400 years old and in the second most populous province in the country and posting surpluses. Good for them, by the way. Premier Couillard, you've got someone who believes in free enterprise and fiscal responsibility, and I quite like his approach, but things are going to have to change. So, finally, how can we, if you're interested, how can we help win those debates? How can we influence those seminally important national events? Well, we should get one of those little rubber bands, maybe, Chris, and it should just say, what would the ICBA do? That would be part of it. I'm deadly serious. We'll need business groups and individuals to have the courage and the boldness that this organization has had to speak very, very plainly to issues, to get involved in the politics of things. We'll also need all of us to be able to stand against some of the rhetoric and devices that the other group will use. For example, the notion of social license, folks. You know, I know that the new national carbon tax, not what has been in place here, but the new national carbon tax was billed as a way to earn social license so that there could be approvals for pipelines. If we would just self-immolate, if we would just tax ourselves and apologize for our industry, if we would overregulate the sector and say that we're sorry we have the third greatest oil reserves on the planet, then that would take someone who hates pipelines and turn them into someone that supports pipelines. I don't think that social license is a thing, ladies and gentlemen. So what can we do? Well, if I drove in Vancouver and paid $1.60 a liter, I'd probably drive a little faster. I'd probably get pulled over, and if I did, I'd be tempted to give the police officer both my vehicle certification, registration, and my social license, just to see if that might help. But we can be engaged. We can be involved. And ladies and gentlemen, I would say with respect, let's be involved in these events that are upcoming, even if they're outside the borders of your province. I think one way we can be more effective in our involvement is that we would introduce those that are impacted, those people you employ, those who benefit greatly from the sectors that we want to see to continue to flourish and be the foundation for economic growth in Western Canada and for the country. And there are many stories of hope and opportunity in each of your businesses that you could tell. Let me tell you one from my province. It's about a woman named Denise Bougie. Denise was originally from Uranium City, Saskatchewan, just below the border with the Northwest Territories. She lived in the city of Prince Albert for some years. That's where Tammy's from, originally, Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. She had a tough time there. She became addicted to drugs. She was incarcerated at a healing lodge near my hometown of Swift Current, a First Nations healing lodge. And that's where things started to turn around for Denise. What really made a difference, she said, was the birth of her granddaughter. She saw the baby and she knew she had to change, and she made an amazing decision. At the age of 40, she decided she was going to become an electrician. And she started taking the training. She worked as an apprentice at a company called Flyer Electric, which is controlled by the Athabasca Basin Development, which is a company owned by Aboriginal communities, by First Nations and Métis communities in northern Saskatchewan. She worked for Flyer as an apprentice and got to go to visit Cameco's McLean Lake and Cigar Lake uranium mine. Cameco is the world's largest uranium miner, headquartered in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Today, she's got a full-time job at Cameco, working as a mill operator. She's credentialed. She has a Red Seal IP Journey Personal Electrician certification. She's training her son now to be an electrician too. And she says, quote, now her options are endless. Just a few years removed from that healing lodge near Swift Current, Saskatchewan. Now her options are endless. And she is working in the uranium industry. The very same uranium industry that the new leader of the NDP in my province said he would shut down. That the LEAP manifesto says should be shut down. That's the kind of plain speaking that we need on our side of this argument, of this debate. And I like bar graphs and pie charts too, but I think our chances are better with Angela to tell those stories of the people that you employ, the people that benefit in real ways from these sectors, the jobs that are created, the quality of life that is created. I am hopeful. There's some recent trends that things are shifting a bit in the province. 7 out of 10 Ontarians polled last week said they oppose a carbon tax. Didn't think it was an effective way to deal with climate change, which they cared about. They just didn't think it was the right way. And I think the most recent poll, an Angus Reid poll on Trans Mountain here in this province, 54% of British Columbians say they support the pipeline going ahead. And that was reported on CBC, so you know that's the truth. It's all very encouraging, but we need to continue the effort, make the case, make it on behalf of Angela. When you're looking at those anti-pipeline protesters, maybe some of them are funded by foreign entities, and considering that they look pretty organized and pretty formidable, think of Angela. We have a strong, strong case, ladies and gentlemen. We need to make it. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. Hey, Tom.
Good morning, Brad.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
You know, one of the things I worried about when I left journalism was I thought, damn, I'm never going to get to hear Brad Wall give a campaign speech again. Thank you for a blast from the past.
Thanks.
That was great. I want to point out just before we start, and I want to add my thanks to Chris Gardner, Bob Rennie, Greg Davignon, who's a huge supporter here as well, all terrific folks who have put together this very important conference. It's been great, and thank you very much for having me part of this. I just want to point out that although there's a lot of us guys up here talking, there are some extraordinary women in this room today. I really do want to point that out, and with my apologies to not mentioning every single one of them, as I do every time I'm in British Columbia, let me point out what a huge fan I am of Carol Taylor. And if we could all be like that, we'd be a much better country for it. So let me start off with a confession.
Uh-oh.
A little over 10 years ago, when I was in our bureau in Washington, D.C., on this particular day, I had Jesse Jackson in for an interview into the Bureau. And as I was saying goodbye to Jesse Jackson, in walks Brad Wall, who I had never heard of before.
Yeah.
I knew he was the new Premier of Saskatchewan.
I don't think Jesse Jackson had ever heard of me before either. I'm pretty sure.
He phoned me the next day and he said,
Who was that?
"You had Brad Wall in here and you didn't tell me?"
Yeah, that's about right.
Two terrifically nice guys, by the way. And what really struck me at the time was that in their own way, both of them were revolutionaries within their societies, obviously in completely different ways, but nonetheless both impressive. And I must admit, even as a journalist, you're not supposed to do this, but from that first meeting, I've been not only a great admirer of Brad's, but a good friend as well over the years. And you're unique in this country. We don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
For example, inexplicably, you support the Rough Riders instead of the Grey Cup winning Ottawa Red Blacks, and I've never understood that deficiency in your life.
I just say this. So Greg canvassed a number of issues that we tried to change in our province, and so I pointed out prior to the 2007 election campaign that the Grey Riders had never won. The NDP were in power for almost 60 years. The Riders had never won a Grey Cup with them in power. And so I said, look, I'm not trying to inject football into this election campaign. I'm just saying, 3 weeks after we won the election, the Riders won the Grey Cup. So sometimes you just really need a lot of good luck, and we got some good luck.
I want to start off with the news of the morning, which is interesting. Kinder Morgan, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to check your Twitter feeds. I think before Chris Wallace spoke, we were all diving for Twitter, because that's what you do when you're talking about American politics these days. So the federal Liberal government has announced as of this morning that they are going to be indemnifying Kinder Morgan for the costs of any delays on the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Some might argue this is a much better approach than taking an equity position or an outright loan to Kinder Morgan. But what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, you need to credit the federal government. I mean, in my remarks, in my little analogy about the auto sector, the last point was the federal government saying, look, they're to another province that wasn't allowing for products to move across the country that they didn't approve, but they wouldn't do anything about it. This is something. This is something. And so we need to give credit where it's due, that the federal government takes it seriously. You know, I haven't seen all the details yet in terms of the term on this thing, because I'm not sure what we're waiting for. I'm not sure I don't know when Premier Horgan and the Green Party coalition are going to change their mind. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a long ways. If the minority government lasts, it's a long ways to the next election. What does that mean in terms of costs? And even with the indemnification, how patient will Kinder Morgan be? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I think there was a few things ahead of this that the federal government might have done, and I've said so publicly. You know, in our province, they said, look, if you won't impose the carbon tax, you will not receive $60 million worth of low carbon infrastructure dollars for which you're eligible. You're not going to get it. So fair enough. And yet just about 3 weeks ago, the federal government was in the province of British Columbia and signed about a $4-point-something billion infrastructure deal over 10 years. Was that not a point of leverage? As they saw it as a point of leverage on the carbon tax, on a province defying the feds on a carbon. How about a province defying the federal government, federal approval of a pipeline? Transfer payments, which are more significant than the $4 billion, is that a point of leverage? But I'm interested to look at the details of this, and I'm glad there's some movement on the part of the federal government. And I'm not sure what, I'm sure Kinder Morgan, the feds wouldn't have announced it if the company wasn't at least somewhat satisfied that this was going to help.
Well, you've certainly hit all the right questions as far as I'm concerned, because they were the same questions I had. If you're covering loss, how long does that go on for? Is there a cap on the loss? If this thing goes on as it could for another 2 or 3 years, are we in the hook? And finally, if the delay in this project is primarily John Horgan and British Columbia, should it not be John Horgan and British Columbia who pays the cost of the delays?
Mindful that we're in a room full of British Columbian taxpayers.
I just asked the question. You give the answer.
I think a lot of other Canadians might be asking that same question, and a lot of other Canadian politicians and former politicians would try to evade that same question. I think it's a reasonable one to ask. The other thing about this here, Tom, think about this, folks. So if you're on the outside looking in, and maybe you thought if you're the proponent for Energy East, you thought somewhere down the road we can maybe reanimate that project, or maybe it's some new greenfield pipeline or another expansion that's needed. Pipelines need to be replaced, obviously. Would this make you feel better about your chances for approval or to get a pipeline built in the province, especially when you combine it with Spill C-60, which is before the House of Commons right now? And the other concern, I mean, the federal government is trying to do something on Kinder Morgan, to their credit. But between C-68 and just the chill and the fact that government had to come in and backstop a company, I'm not sure what it does to the climate, that we're worried about the competitiveness issues that we have in the country.
And even that may not be enough to convince Kinder Morgan in Texas to keep up with this project.
Well, I'll be interested to see their response.
Yeah, and I'm wondering though if you could outline for me, and then I want to turn this political, as much as I know you hate talking political stuff, but let's imagine a scenario for a moment whereby either Kinder Morgan itself pulls out of the project, or that the delays are so interminable that it just becomes a money-losing proposition. What happens to Canada at that point? What happens to our investment climate and foreign direct investment?
Well, Greg showed us the chart about what's already happening to foreign direct investment. I think the Fraser Institute's been working on a project there to better answer that question. It's clearly been hit already, notwithstanding, prior even to the Kinder Morgan issue, for the reasons that I also touched on in my remarks. So I'm worried about that. That can be fixed. You can fix that with a change in economic policies. That can be fixed with a change in regulatory policies, and governments can change. What I'm more worried about is if that scenario unfolded, and I hope it didn't. And now I'm retired from politics, so I can answer your hypothetical question.
Okay.
I'm worried about the state of the country. I have never seen in my years in public life, and I ran for the first time in '99, the amount of Western alienation, and maybe it's not as prevalent in BC, or maybe it is in the interior, but Saskatchewan and Alberta, I've been in Alberta quite a bit, and obviously Saskatchewan's still our home. I've never seen it at the level it's at, folks, and so I would worry that would just really exacerbate an already stressed situation if that scenario unfolded.
Mm. You hear it all the time. Certainly, any of the people that I deal with in my new business, and it comes down to one word, and that is certainty. Knowing what the playing field is. And what you hear time and time again, not only internally in Canada, but for example, one of the folks that I work with is a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East. And they look at the Canadian landscape and they're worried by two things. One is they're worried about their money being trapped and in endless hearings, regulations, and that sort of thing. And the other thing they worry about is that there's no project big enough for them to be interested in. And somehow I think those two things are connected. That when you have uncertainty in terms of how that money is going to work, and therefore what type of projects that brings on, you have that sort of double whammy effect. So when you take a look at certainty, and I want to put it in the context of taxes, specifically carbon taxes, there have been a host of CEOs of oil companies in this country who have said, I actually do want a carbon tax. I do want a carbon tax because it achieves goals for me that otherwise are not there. And I think it's virtually every CEO of every major oil company in this country. For that reason alone, should we be against carbon tax, or should we create certainty?
First of all, I see you've got the article there about the number of CEOs from the energy sector that support the carbon tax. I mean, that's been changing a little bit, frankly, especially with some of our largest Canadian conventional producers are not supportive of the carbon tax. And they're even having discussions within their industry association. There's a couple of them, EPAC, CAP, and so that's the first point. Secondly, when the carbon tax was announced in the province of Alberta, there was, I think, 5 of those major companies lined up behind the government. Do you know how many are left in Canada? I think 2. I believe 3 are gone, part of that $40 billion. We support a carbon tax for all of you. We'll see you in Texas. So for them, certainty mattered. I would guess, because they chose, there's $40 billion in energy sector investment that hasn't left energy, it's left Canada. So I think that's part of the answer to your question. It's not all carbon tax. It's much more than that. As I said in my remarks, the whole methane protocol is going to have a big impact, especially if the U.S. would have come along with us, as was the plan with Obama and Trudeau's deal. I don't think it would be as big of an issue, because there wouldn't be a competitive difference on either side of the 49th. But the fact is, they walked away. Pruitt at the EPA, and I met with him, they signaled early on we're not doing it. So it's methane, it's the ability to get pipeline approved. Look at LNG, for example. Look at the rapidity with which it's a serious process they have down there, but look what's happening in terms of approvals there. And so we're being outflanked, and part of it is certainty. You know, I think when it comes to multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects, or mining projects, whether it's a potash mine in Saskatchewan or a pipeline or an LNG port, surprises are for birthday parties. I think it's just companies are going to make decisions. If you change the NEB rulings midstream on Energy East, so now you're measuring upstream and downstream emissions, and that somehow is a factor in the regulatory process, when you won't do it for a giant cement facility in Quebec or a car industry or any other sector, at least the energy sector would say, I think, in their boardrooms, man, I'm not sure I can handle the uncertainty, never mind the competitive disadvantage of an investment in the country. And Craig pointed out this strange sort of dichotomy between GDP numbers and what's happening in BC. But it's, I think, our job now, it's our obligation to look at the long term. What about the foundational aspects of our economy, at what's at the core, and how healthy is it? And you used the word eroding, and I think that's the right word, if we're not focused on some of these things, on certainty.
Should we be matching our tax regime to the American tax regime to meet that competitive disadvantage?
We should be doing no further harm, right? At the very least, let's start from that basis, because we've said under the federal plan, we've hardwired the escalation of a carbon tax into our economy, into the energy sector. Americans have gone the other way. The provinces can have an impact there in terms of royalties. You know, we can make sure our royalties are competitive. That's a role for the provincial governments, and I know one that my successor, Premier Moe, is concerned about. He wants to be competitive, but it's expensive, right? If the more you take out of that out of that pocket, the less you have for healthcare and education and highways, and yet. And in the long term, you got to be competitive. You got to keep the industries and the jobs.
Well, and then I guess there's what you would call the moral hazard, and that is, while reducing taxes certainly has a stimulative effect and eliminates some of the competitive disadvantage we have, as we're seeing in the United States, the deficits are going through the roof.
Yeah.
And that's the moral hazard. But how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, again, you can start from the premise of doing no further harm. And I think that's a good message for the current federal government and the provincial governments, because before we hardwire tax increases and cost escalations into our energy sector that's already struggling to compete, when the Americans are going the other way, we should at least have a reasonable discussion, and then have a further discussion on the carbon tax, for example, about its efficacy, even at the highest level, even when it's fully implemented. Because the federal documents that have been released say it needs to be $200 a ton to hit Paris targets. Well, then they won't have to worry about emissions from cars anyway, because no one's going to be driving to work at $200. This is a northern economy with trade-exposed industries that are at its foundation. We want to diversify, and we are. We want we want tech, we want all these other industries, but they will be built most successfully on a strong foundation of what we do very well in this country, and it's natural resources, and it's agriculture, it's mining. Those aren't bad sectors. They aren't old economy sectors. They're still foundational to what the future has to be, and I think we need to be proud of that, and I think we need to make sure we have policies that are reflective of the fact that these sectors need to be strong. And just quickly to finish that point, so we're a northern economy with trade-exposed industries. So if there's concern, if the carbon tax is not going to reduce emissions, which we should care about, then we should have an honest discussion about whether that's the best way to fight climate change, or whether we should be collectively maybe investing in technology. There's 2,000 coal plants being built around the world while we worry about our 2% emissions here and go through the process of a carbon tax. Not that we shouldn't do our part, But what if Canada decided, we're going to help find a solution to cleaning up coal because, Modi went to Paris and he said, hey, Western economies, you had your chance with coal and cheap fossil fuel. I have 300 million Indians without electricity who are using dung to warm themselves, to warm their homes. I'm building coal. Hard to blame them. But then can Canada, and in Saskatchewan this is something we've tried, could we perhaps be leaders in CCS and cleaning up coal? If we invested all the resources and effort that we have into a carbon tax, nationally imposing a carbon tax into sort of a manned moon mission approach to new technology that will help even just clean up coal a little bit, I think we might be doing more for the planet than $20 a ton in an economy that's 2% of the worldwide emissions.
Let me move you into some other areas where you've got some deep expertise. No other premier, certainly at my time when I was in Washington, showed as much curiosity and interest in the process than you did. You were down there a lot. You made some terrific contacts when you were down there. And I would say, and I'm not saying this because you're sitting here, but I'd say you did that better than any other premier at the time did. When you take a look at where we are right now, specifically with NAFTA, are we doing it the right way?
First of all, I got to give credit to former Ambassador David Wilkins. The province of Saskatchewan doesn't have a full-time office in Washington. Some provinces do, we don't. But we hired a firm. When Ambassador Wilkins was done his term as U.S. Ambassador to Canada, he joined a firm called Nelson Mullins, and we contracted with them, and they were just fantastic in terms of the programs that we got, and not just that, but substantive progress on issues like country of origin labeling, which you and I talked about on your show. It was this intractable issue that wouldn't go away, and it finally did, and so I got to give credit there, but I'm grateful for that. As a result of that, I developed a friendship with Lindsey Graham and John McCain, and could tell that story at the end if we have time about the last time we were with those folks for dinner. But it's David that deserves a lot of that credit. We did go down on issues, especially trade issues. Obviously, that would be the major reason for a mission to Washington, although there might have been some economic development work that can be done. And a lot of other provinces, Gary Doer, when he was Premier of Manitoba, was very proactive and turned out to be, I believe, an excellent ambassador for our country.
I agree with you.
And an inspired choice by Prime Minister Harper, even though he's a Bombers fan. So on NAFTA, I think the federal government and the Prime Minister, in full credit, I think he started out completely on point, and I said so publicly. I mean, first of all, he was personally engaged in the file. Minister Freeland was obviously in Washington as much as need be. He called in Brian Mulroney, who he knew had good contacts with Secretary Ross. I think Mulroney met with sort of a war cabinet he had on the NAFTA file. I can't imagine the Prime Minister getting it right any more than he did at the very beginning. And I'm not sure, and I still think by and large, our federal government has managed what would have been, can you imagine listening to Mr. Wallace, what it would be like to try to deal with the administration that's there. I think the federal government deserves credit for their approach to NAFTA. I would just say this, though. There was a moment in last fall when we started sort of, as Canadians, we started interjecting certain issues like gender, right, into the trade, that we were going to signal that gender would be important in the trade deal. Or we were, I think the Prime Minister sort of sounded off against the number of states that are right-to-work states. There's about 37 or now. And I think with this, with how incendiary the administration might be, I just think, just stay away from those issues, from sort of the virtue signaling, let's get a trade deal. But by and large, I think we're on I know it's getting down to it, but I think the federal government have done a very good job and deserve credit for that.
So you can't just throw out Lindsey Graham and John McCain and dinner and without me obviously asking the question, so how was dinner?
So we've gotten to know Lindsey really well over the years, Tammy and I, and he's a great guy. He's one of those politicians you hope he's a good example for the rest of us. He's the same. If you know Lindsey from the talk shows, sometimes with Wallace, he's the same guy in a private room. Great sense of humor and big supporter of this country, of Canada, and of the relationship, and some of the things we were doing in Saskatchewan. So at my last trade mission to Washington, David had just called him. David's very good friends with Lindsay, Ambassador Wilkins, and said, "Do you want to come for dinner? Wall's down here again." And he said, "Sure. Can I bring along a buddy?" And Wilkins said, "I don't know I don't know. Who is it?" He said, "Oh, it's McCain." And I'd had the chance to meet Senator McCain a couple times, again through Ambassador Wilkins. He's got a great sense of humor. The first time I met McCain, I was with Ambassador Wilkins, who has a very thick South Carolina accent. He walks right up to me, the senator does, and says, "You must be the guy from Canada that hired this guy. Do you have an English South Carolina dictionary? Because if you do, I could use it. I don't understand a word he says." And they came for dinner, and they had just come from the White House, Tom. If you remember when the president decided to undertake the missile strikes in Syria, the night before they had met with the president. I think at the president's bidding, to his credit. So whatever the relationship, that we heard discussed here, I think both McCain and Lindsay were there that evening and just came over for a quick bite afterwards and sort of told that story. And we're very fair about it. I mean, obviously it would have been a chance for John McCain to say a whole bunch of things about the president based on their past, and he didn't. He wanted to talk about the issue. He thought the president was about to make the right decision. And they offered their advice, and it was fascinating. These two lions of the Senate for dinner, and then and where they had come from.
And I'll just add that I've had the great pleasure of getting to know John McCain pretty well over the years. He's a terrific friend of Canada's.
He is.
There's a thing called the Halifax International Security Forum.
Right.
Senator McCain has been there since day one.
Right.
And has led a congressional delegation. So it's interesting, and you found this out much to your credit, that we are not alone up here, that there are many in the United States who share our views. Listen, I just want to get political here for a moment, because that's the landscape you occupied. One of the other things that happened today, and I want you to put this in the context of whether you think that this is a direction that we're moving in, and let me set the stage here. Jason Kenney was asked about Justin Trudeau and his views on Justin Trudeau. Here's the quote. This is from Jason Kenney. "I know Justin. This guy is an empty trust fund millionaire who has the political depth of a finger bowl. He can't read a briefing note longer than a cocktail napkin."
When did he say that?
He said that last night, yeah.
Last night?
Yeah. Now, I ask this in the context of saying that whatever one thinks of Justin Trudeau or whatever one thinks of Jason Kenney, part of the political discussion, and especially with Chris Wallace, we were talking about this last night, was the nature of political discourse. And as we're facing tough problems, as in how do we get our resources to market? How do we encourage foreign direct investment? And there are going to be difficult days ahead as we go through that. What's your take on this sort of language being injected? It could be, and I'll open the door to this, it could be fair game. I mean, is it legitimate political discourse?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what another, a politician's tactics or words that they choose, because that's up to them. Ronald Reagan has set a pretty good example for people that are political nerds and follow politics, because he was pretty strident in his views, very strident in his views. But I think he was the first happy warrior. You heard the term a few times up here today. And a happy warrior means just that. You can be very effective in the case that you make but being perhaps a little bit more circumspect on sort of personal commentary. About your opponent, and that's all Reagan ever called him. If you look at his first acceptance speech from his first nomination, I don't think he used the word Democratic Party. Never mind the presumptive nominee. He just called him my opponent, my respected opponent, and was pretty darn effective in making the case, litigating his case. I think from a communications perspective, again, setting aside whatever we think about the policies. So. I used to have a policy, my own personal policy in the Legislative Assembly was that if I heckled you, Tom, and I couldn't smile at you after I said it, that meant I just said it out of plain anger, and I wanted to just kind of be a jerk. So on those occasions, if I couldn't smile after I heckled, I wrote an apology note and sent it across I asked the page to send it across. And I think I said, honey, how many? I think I gave 3 apology notes, and then I was And I was really done because that's not much fun to write apology notes. But so you get caught up in things. And we feel strongly about, especially in a place like a legislative assembly or the parliament, you feel strongly. And so there's a back and forth. And that's not completely unhealthy. And maybe even if we take the odd shot across the bow, make the odd shot across the bow, if we can smile afterwards, in other words, if there's at least some humor in it, maybe that's okay.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. I mean, Ronald Reagan had that famous line when he was dealing with an opponent, and he said, "I won't use your youth and inexperience against you." And of course, Churchill also had that gift. It leads me, though, into asking you for your sense of, as this whole issue roils over carbon tax, and we may have I think it's highly likely we'll have a government in Ontario in the next few weeks that will be completely on board with the arguments that you're making. And I'm wondering how you see that playing out. Let's start with Alberta. We've got this fight now between Alberta and British Columbia, which now has included Saskatchewan in it as well. How does that get resolved? What happens? Does it get resolved if Notley loses the next election and Jason Kenney wins? Where do you see it all going?
I think it resolves where it matters most in rooms like this with people, businesses, and associations in each province if the pipeline gets built, right? And people can argue, maybe we had the discussion about, is government sort of mitigating the private companies' risk the way to go? Either way, if in 4 or 5 years the pipeline's built, we'll have been through this difficult period. I'm not sure it matters too much about the elections, although those are important events for other reasons I've talked about in terms of economic policy in Alberta, Ontario, and Canada going forward. So I think that matter is resolved if the pipeline gets approved, notwithstanding who might get elected in various jurisdictions.
And expanding it out and coming back to the carbon tax, we're sort of coming full circle here. We have a federal election coming up in 2019. There's probably no issue greater at this point for the future of the government than what happens with the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And I say that because politically, again, this morning in the press conference that Justin Trudeau held, although there wasn't a lot of information in there, he lashed out at Premier Horgan, making it very clear that now the feds are clearly in this fight and have clearly identified British Columbia John Horgan, I shouldn't say British Columbia, I should say John Horgan, as the enemy. How, in your view, if you have substantial provincial opposition to a carbon tax, strained relations between the provinces, strained relations between the federal government and some of the other provinces, is it even reasonable to expect that the federal government could suddenly eat itself whole and back down on this?
On its position on Kinder Morgan?
On carbon tax. Yeah.
No, I think there's two possible points, two possible sources for relief for those of us who don't want it, and that would be the court, would be number one, and lawyers will discuss about the chances of success that we've already asked for a reference. Our province has asked for a reference from the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan. And the other one that's a sure remedy is a general election, federally, right? And if the Liberals are reelected and the courts provide no remedy, well, then we're going to have to figure this out. Provinces that are intransigent, the rebel provinces like your Saskatchewan and my Saskatchewan.
Let me get your prediction. Sorry.
Tom, one more question.
Hey?
We're there. One more question.
Well, my final question is, when can we do this again? Because one of my greatest pleasures when I had my show was having you on, and I've been reminded how much fun it is to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay.
I appreciate it very much. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both very much. The discussion was insightful. The issues that you were talking about go right to the heart of our economic prosperity and what it means to be part of Canada. So, Tom, Brad, thank you very much for that. Thanks. And to the rest and to all of our sponsors. To our sponsors, once again, thank you, and to everyone, thank you all very much for being here this morning. We look forward to hosting you again next year. Have a great day.